This is one in a series of interviews conducted by the Air Force Historical Division in conjunction with the Air Force Office of Information. I am Arthur Marmore of the Historical Division. These interviews are part of an oral history program that is intended to capture and preserve information on the history of the Air Force as seen by the men who helped make the Air Force. We hope these interviews will not only provide documentation for historians, but also serve as an enduring inspiration for the men and women of the Air Force. Today we are interviewing General O. P. Weyland, a distinguished combat commander during World War II and the Korean War. General Weyland, whose military career began in 1923, was commanding general of the 19th Tactical Air Command, which supported the Third Army in its historic dash across France in World War II. During the Korean War, General Weyland was commander of the Far East Air Forces. Between 1954 and his retirement in 1959, General Weyland was commander of the Tactical Air Command. Sir, after graduating from Texas A&M in 1923, you entered the Air Service. What first aroused your interest in the Air Force as a career?
Well, my first interest, of course, was aroused when I was an engineering student at Texas A&M. That traditionally was and still is a military school. There was no Air Service, it was then called, ROTC there at the time, and I enrolled in the Field Artillery branch. But about 1920 or 21, I believe it was, the first of 5 Air Service ROTC units were established in 5 different colleges, and I switched over to that branch. Upon my graduation from college, I had no intention, really, of going into the military service. I thought that my brilliant talents as a young engineer could best be used in industry. I accordingly signed a contract with the Western Electric Company, but with the proviso that I would have a leave of absence to go down and take a flying course, because I did want to fly. I went down to Brooksfield, took a brief course of 4 months in pilot training for Reserve and National Guard officers, and received a JAP, a Junior Airplane Pilot rating, same wings as the airplane pilot. I went back to Chicago with Western Electric and, somewhat to my dismay, learned that there was perhaps as much or even more red tape in industry than there was in the Army. That organization was very large with several thousand engineers, several of whom I thought were almost as good as I was. So, and they had quite a seniority rating and things of that sort. So I thought my talents could be best used at the Bell Laboratories, and I wangled the agreement that I was to go there. In the interim, I used to go down to Chanute Field at Grand Toul, Illinois, and fly Jennies and Voughts on weekends. The flying bug had really bitten me at about that time. Then one day I was informed that I was not to go to Bell Laboratories, but that I was to be assigned to an engineering division at there in Chicago. In somewhat of a huff, I went down to the, in the meantime, I forgot to mention, I rather casually took the examination for a regular commission one weekend down at Chanute Field, and in due course had been notified by the Adjutant General of the Army of my appointment as a regular officer in the Army as a second lieutenant. I did nothing about it for 2 or 3 months until I was told that I was not going to the Bell Labs. In somewhat of a huff, I went down to the telegraph office and sent in an acceptance of that commission, and then reported down to Brooksfield again and joined the class that was about to graduate and went over to Kelly, where I subsequently graduated. That launched me in my career in what subsequently became the Air Force.
Would you say, sir, that there was any single individual who had a great influence on your career?
Well, after I graduated from Kelly, I went to Fort Sam Houston with a detachment of the 12th Observation Squadron. Later, the entire squadron was there at Fort Sam. As the junior officer there, it fell my lot to do most of the tactical work, which was reconnaissance and observation. I also got most of the squadron jobs. I was supply officer, mess officer, communications officer, armament officer. I ran a photo section. I had both accountable and responsible supply accounts and so on. So I got a great deal of experience at that time. There was an officer there, a brigade commander, and at the moment his name escapes me, who was a very, very brilliant tactician. I used to engage in, from an aerial point of view, and these various maneuvers day in and day out, month in and month out, year in and year out with the elements of the 2nd Division. This brigade commander, as I say, was a brilliant officer, and at the conclusion of each maneuver in which I operated in the air, I would land out in the field next to where they were holding their critique, and I would participate in the critique. I gained very, very many lessons and an insight into the operations organization, the employment of ground forces, which I'd never gotten from any other individual. So I'd say that that ground officer had quite an influence on my subsequent career.
Looking back at this career of great length and significance, what would you say, sir, was your most significant contribution?
Well, in the early years prior to World War II, I can't say that I made any significant contributions to the flying arm. Perhaps the best thing I did that might be considered a contribution was that I learned my trade, I think, rather thoroughly. I got to know Air Force or Air Service employment tactics, and I made a few little minor improvements in the observation and reconnaissance technology, perhaps. But the main thing I did was to learn the trade thoroughly, so that subsequently, when I was faced with the real problems of war, I felt I was prepared for them.
Well,
now,
okay. Right ahead, sir. Well, I was going to ask you, sir, about in considering your whole career, what would you say?
Well, I think you have a question later. There were other things that I think that during World War II, I think we made some contributions, and I won't say that I made them. The entire 19th Tactical Air Command and my very hard-working and brilliant staff and commanders were more responsible than I. But we did really advance the art, I do believe, particularly the flexible employment of tactical air in joint operations. I think we made some forward steps, if you choose to consider that as a contribution. And in the Korean War, in a similar way, we made further steps in adaptability of tactical air to the situation that existed at that time. Then another might be a very real contribution, I'd say, was in peacetime, and that had to do with the concept and the organization and employment of composite air strike forces and its associated 19th Tactical Air Force. I think we will probably discuss that a little more detail later.
Looking back at your career, sir, what would you say were your most difficult decisions?
Well, as a junior officer prior to World War II, I didn't have any difficult decisions. Yes, I commanded a fighter group, and there were some tough times, but from an historical standpoint, they're just the same as the problems that any other squadron or group commander has, and they're not of world-shattering significance. Everybody else has been through the same problems and decisions, I dare say, and they're not worth while recording. In combat, of course, you do have some difficult decisions. I dare say the most difficult that I had was the necessity of ordering combat units on difficult missions with a cold, clear certainty that very appreciable losses would be incurred. I was bolstered in those decisions by the conviction that it is better to accept X losses today and to achieve decisive results than to temporize, take an easier way, and accept 1/2 X losses today, then 1/2 X losses tomorrow, and perhaps 1/2 X losses the next day, and perhaps without achieving the decisive results that are necessary to get on. That always was a heart twister. Well, I think
that's a fine answer. What was your most interesting and satisfying assignment, sir?
Well, the most interesting and satisfying assignments, of course, is your test in battle. The first being when I wrangled a combat command to take to Europe, which was the 84th Fighter Wing, but I was quickly reassigned as commander of the 19th Tactical Air Command. And that, of course, was my first test in war. It worked. We thought we were pretty good. We won the war, so that obviously was, up to that period in my career, was the most satisfying experience. And in a similar way, my command experience during the Korean War was similarly exciting and satisfying. Now, I don't mean to imply that those are necessarily the most important. Many staff assignments perhaps could be construed as being more important, but those were certainly the most satisfying.
In the late 1920s, General Weyland, you became an instructor in advanced flying at Kelly Field. What were your major problems as an instructor in those days, and how did you go about solving them?
Flying instruction, ground school instruction in those days, I would say was handled on a casual basis, but it was not as regimented, I dare say, as it is today. We really had no particularly difficult problems. Problems, I dare say, were those of the antiquity of our aircraft in those days where we were flying World War I aircraft, DHs. They were not as good as we might have had, but that's what we had. There were no difficult problems, really.
How would you describe your duties in the late, in the late 20s and early 30s when you became a commander of an observation squadron in Hawaii?
Well, that was a satisfying experience, of course. A command is always satisfying. And when I made the decision to stay in the Air Force, I also made the decision to endeavor to stay in operations, in tactical work. So the command of an operational unit was the best thing that you could have in peacetime, and a squadron commander's job is perhaps the most satisfying. That's where you are in the most intimate relationship with your enlisted men and your officers, and you know everybody's problems and you are responsible for them. There was nothing particularly difficult about that. The squadron I had in Hawaii, the 4th Observation Squadron, we would call it reconnaissance today, carried on a daily basis operational work with the Hawaiian Infantry Division. We kept up that work. We also functioned as two-place fighters and attack aircraft. And I thoroughly enjoyed shooting and bombing, and we normally, my squadron normally won the trophies for gunnery and bombing over there, I'm glad to say, and we loved it. So, but there was nothing extremely difficult. We had slightly more advanced aircraft. At that time, I had a thing called the O-19, which was the first metal monocoque fuselage airplane we had in the Air Service or the Air Corps, whatever it happened to be at that time.
During the late 30s, General Weyland, you attended the Air Corps Tactical School and then the Command and General Staff School. How valuable would you say this education was in preparing you for your later career?
Oh, it was very, very valuable indeed. No question about it. The Air Corps Tactical School was a very forward-looking institution, and they were examining and teaching and studying concepts of air employment, which the remainder of the services, frankly, had not thought about. I had a fairly easy time at that school, really, because about 50% of the instruction was in ground arms and their organization and employment. And because of my intimate experience with the 2nd Infantry Division, day in and day out operations with them, I knew the ground forces forward and backwards, their organization, their tactics, their employment. So it was not a strange language to me, as it was to many Air Force officers. And on the air tactics and employment, I made a policy of answering on the examination questions, answering and giving the answers that the instructors wanted, and not the ones that I thought should be necessarily, but I gave them the answers they wanted. Consequently, I ranked fairly high in the class. Leavenworth was predominantly a school for ground officers, but again, I learned a little bit about the employment of higher units of the ground forces, and it was useful, I dare say, primarily because of our associations with officers of the other services of the ground forces, which became very valuable later when we were in combat. You can get along in combat with an officer even though there may be some differences of opinion. If he's a friend, you can lay the cards on the table and arrive at a quick decision. If you're strangers, it takes more time.
You've touched on this question already, General Weyland, but how would you describe the aircraft used by the Air Corps before World War II? Were they adequate for their mission?
Well, they were... Initially, we inherited World War I aircraft, DHs and the like. We began some very modest modernization, but you must realize that the overall force structure of the Army, and we were a part of the Army in those days, and of the defense establishment as a whole, was very small indeed. The budgets were very small. So the acquisition of more modern aircraft was quite difficult. We graduated from the DHs into more modern reconnaissance aircraft, into somewhat more modern reconnaissance aircraft, somewhat more modern bombers. By today's standards, of course, they were extremely unsophisticated aircraft, but for that decade, that time in history, I dare say we can assume that they were adequate for the time. They could have been better, of course. Had we put in the money, we didn't have the money, so it was when we actually went to war, they were sort of adequate. Barely adequate, shall we say.
Well, would you say that the development of fighter aircraft received sufficient emphasis in those years?
Oh, fighter aircraft received about the same emphasis as other aircraft, no more nor less than we did on bombers. We graduated from the old SE-5s and that we had inherited from World War I into something a little better, the Curtiss P-1, the Curtiss P-6, then we got Boeing P-12s, and so on, and at the outbreak of, or prior to the outbreak of World War II, we were getting the P-40, which was the most modern aircraft that we had at that time. As it turned out, I think that the P-40, for example, was inferior to the fighters that the Germans had developed, that is to the Me-109 or the Focke-Wulf 190. But I felt it was a little bit superior to the Jap Zero, at least when our boys learned to cash in on the superior aspects, it was better than the Jap Zero.
How would you describe the drive of the Air Force for greater autonomy before World War II?
I've lost my notes here. Let me see if I can get oriented again. What question is this?
Number 5 on mine.
Well, I can remark on that very briefly. It seemed to me that the drive of the Air Corps at the time for greater autonomy prior to World War II was rather passive. The Army, that is, the ground forces, resisted practically any and all efforts that were put forth. But during World War II, General Arnold, with his tremendous drive and vision, prevailed on General Marshall, the Chief of Staff of the Army, and a most enlightened soldier, to give the Air Corps a very large measure of autonomy indeed. So we did eventually make progress.
What would you consider, then, the major problems of the Air Corps before World War II?
Well, the greatest problem, of course, before World War II was the anticipation of the part that we would inevitably have to play. The war was coming upon us very rapidly, and we were far from ready to engage in a major war. The result, of course, was that we had to go on very much of a crash basis once we were in the war.
During World War II, sir, what would you consider were your most important decisions?
Well, I think I remarked on that previously, and that is the decision to send people into combat with a sure knowledge that a lot of them are going to be killed.
Each specific instance, then, was, in that sense, a major decision.
Of its sense, to me, was a major and agonizing decision. It was not a major decision in the sense of the outcome of the war, but to me it was.
Before this period, at the very early part of the war, you held various posts in the Canal Zone. How would you describe the problems and accomplishments of that period?
I was commanding a fighter group down there, the 16th Pursuit Group, that is, and right at my tail end of my service, I pinch-hitted for I think he was then Colonel A.B. McDaniel as Chief of Staff of the 6th Air Force. Our problem, of course, was suddenly being thrust into war. It came upon us rather suddenly. We had anticipated it, and our guns were loaded and bombed up on our P-40s. And we were, prior to the December 7th, we were operating combat patrols over the canal. Turned out it wasn't a problem, actually. It was never attacked. As a matter of fact, one of my officers that was in the 16th Pursuit Group down there later on said, you know, he said, I think we're probably just as good as SAC is now. We were just as good then as SAC is today, because SAC says that we have never had a major war because of their efforts, and he said, now, we never had, because of our efforts, the Canal Zone was never attacked. Apologies.
You were in key air staff positions in 1942 and 43. What were the major problems that the AAF faced as you observed them?
Yes, I was on General Arnold's staff during that hectic period of expansion in 42 and 43. It had become, and I'll follow a few notes here, it had become belatedly apparent that air power would play an extremely important part. The Army Air Corps, upon our entry into the war, was barely skeletal. We had to fill out that skeleton and expand to the force required very rapidly, and hopefully with smoothness and efficiency. We didn't know what the size or composition of the force should be. A special planning staff was created under General Possum Hansel. It evaluated the theaters and jobs to be done and came up with a requirement for an Air Force of some 270 combat groups with the essential supporting structure. We were plunged into what I call the numbers racket. And remember, we didn't have electronic computers in those days. Our staff laboriously computed with pencil and paper the total aircraft requirements. Initial unit equipment, UE for bombers, fighters, tactical reconnaissance, troop carrier, and transports. We computed the aircraft for primary and advanced pilot training, for navigation training, for the operational training units and the replacement training units for bombers and fighters. From this and the best estimates on aircraft production, we tentatively programmed the activation, training, and deployment of the tactical groups and their supporting service units. Then we computed as best we could training attrition on aircraft and the expected combat losses which would have to be replaced. This was all translated into a production requirement of aircraft of some 100,000 aircraft per year. Industry had to enlarge and expand tremendously to meet this demand. General Benny Myers was in charge of aircraft production and gave long-range forecasts of aircraft production by different types. Aircraft availability, then, was the governing factor in our expansion. We reprogrammed our force structure accordingly. Training and tactical airfields were acquired and put under construction and activated. Officers and airmen were inducted into the service. Specialized training was initiated and rapidly expanded for pilots, navigators, gunners, bombardiers, aircraft and engine mechanics, radio operators and mechanics, radar technicians, supply people, truck drivers, cooks, and bottle washers. The proper numbers of these various specialists would report, after varying degrees of individual training, to an operational training unit upon activation of a combat group. When the period of unit operational training was completed and the outfit judged combat ready, their new unit equipment aircraft was supposed to be ready to take overseas with the unit. Myriads of internal problems arose. Long-range aircraft production figures proved inaccurate, and we sometimes had to slip the activation of units. Experience proved we needed more navigators and bombers and troop carrier units. This upset our planning and training programs. Combat experience, I should say, proved the necessity for 2 bomber crews per airplane, per unit aircraft, rather than 1 to 1.5, which we had previously programmed. Another post-crash program was necessary to readjust. I had a hard time allocating sufficient tactical aircraft for training in the United States. General Arnold wanted to send them all overseas to combat. I wanted to retain some seed corn here in this country. Theater air commanders vied and brought all sorts of legitimate pressures to get additional and newer or additional aircraft and units which were not programmed. Sometimes General Arnold would accede to these demands. I was in trouble. That, taken as an entity, was, to my mind, the largest single problem confronting us in Washington in the 42-43 period. With many trials and tribulations, with General Arnold driving, the problem was solved, and the greatest Air Force the world has ever known was achieved. And when I took the field in Europe, the system worked very well indeed. There were some bugs, of course, but we had magnificent support from the air staff here in Washington.
What were your views, sir, on the importance of strategic air power in winning World War II? And related to this, on the importance of the tactical air mission?
When we entered World War II, we were first faced with 2 very formidable adversaries. They were militarily strong, battle-seasoned, had very professional military leadership, and were backed by an excellent sustaining industry. My experience, of course, was primarily with the Germans. In my opinion, preliminary application of strategic air power against the industrial and communications complex of that nation was mandatory. Of key importance was the reduction of the German Air Force prior to an invasion of the continent. The 8th Air Force and the 15th Air Force repeatedly hit aircraft factories, supporting industries such as ball bearing production and oil refineries. The essential degree of air superiority was gradually achieved, largely due to this strategic effort, and a large-scale invasion of the continent could be planned with assurance of success. It is interesting, however, that as we fought our way through France, Belgium, and Luxembourg into Germany, I found the German Air Force still had thousands of serviceable combat aircraft. I had a headquarters at the end of the war near Schweinfurt. I inspected the ball-bearing facilities there, and the German managers showed me underground and dispersed plants and told me that they had met all required production of ball bearings. Apparently that was not a key target, as it turned out. The key, however, the key to the success of the strategic air forces was the gradual disintegration of, and the gradual disintegration of the German Air Force was the lack of POL. Here, the strategic air forces had achieved truly decisive results. The Germans had plenty of pilots, but their experience level was rapidly going down as combat attrition took its toll. There was simply not enough aviation gasoline to properly train replacement pilots. POL for combat was limited, so our problem in maintaining and strengthening air superiority became minimal. Now, related to this subject was an interesting occurrence. On 5 December 1945, I believe it was, General Spaatz called a meeting of all the senior air commanders at his headquarters near Paris. Present at the meeting were General Spaatz, USAF commander, Air Marshal Bomber Harris of the British Bomber Command, General Doolittle, 8th Air Force, all strategic. Also there were the tactical people, General Louis Brereton of the 1st Airborne Army, General Vandenberg, 9th Air Force, General Royce, his deputy, Air Marshal Maury Cunningham of the British Tactical Air Forces, Pete Quesada of the 9th TAC, Opie Weyland, myself of the 19th TAC, Dick Nugent of the 29th, and Gordon Seville of the 12th TAC. General Eisenhower was also in attendance, the only ground officer there. Of course, he was the commander-in-chief of all forces. The meeting led off by the strategic air members expressing concern that they had about concluded their strategic bombing efforts and that their efforts were not apparently hastening the end of the war, their efforts at that time. In short, they felt that they were spinning their wheels and wanted to know if they could apply their forces to the tactical job usefully and get the war rolling again. The ground forces about that time were pretty well bogged down. As I remember it, the commander of the British 2nd TAF said that this wouldn't be the proper employment of strategic air power. Pete Quesada said he'd like to have the Roar River Dam knocked out. Discussion brought out that this was a dubious undertaking. I then got in my pitch. I said I had a plan which would get our armies moving again and terminate the war much more quickly. I further said that I was associated with an army which would really fight, and that I had General George Patton's authority to commit his army. I did. I outlined the plan. First, 3rd Army, given the ammunition and the go-ahead and priority on supplies, would advance to the Siegfried Line in not less than 2 weeks. Second, on D-Day, which I estimated to be about December 22nd, all bomber forces would hit individual targets along the Siegfried Line in front of the 3rd Army. I had already conducted a successful experiment with a few groups of Sam Anderson's medium bomber command, and 3rd Army had established a small salient at one point. I was confident that this part of the plan would work. Third, the 3rd Army would then breach the Siegfried Line, advance rapidly to the Rhine River, cross it, and then go down the Rhine River back of the forward German armies. The 3rd Army was to have, in all those operations, to have priority in all tactical air support. General Eisenhower kind of grinned, said he'd buy the idea. General Spaatz agreed. I called General Patton and said, I've just committed your army to an operation which will end the war in a hurry. Eisenhower and Spaatz have agreed. He dubiously asked me what it was all about. I told him he would get top priority for everything he needed, and that all strategic bombers and all necessary tactical air support would be put in front of him and would support his operation. Uncle Georgie just said, hot damn. I flew back to Nancy and outlined the events to General Patton. He was jubilant. Next day, General Spots, Doolittle, and Vandenberg arrived and confirmed the deal. Strategic air planners were sent to my headquarters. We worked up Operation Tink in detail. I wrote my wife, nicknamed Tink, that she was going to get a rather unique Christmas gift. Third Army advanced solidly along the Siegfried Line just as I had said they would. Air and ground units were ready. Then the Germans launched the Battle of the Bulge. Although Patton and I pleaded that this was made to order for our operation and would enhance the success of Operation Tink and its encirclement, we were ordered to immediately intervene directly in the Bulge. I later discussed Operation Tink with Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the Commander-in-Chief west of the German forces. He said he had concentrated his forces at the Bulge and that the operation, in his opinion, would most probably have succeeded. Now, a question about tactical, I believe, huh?
Related to this was the importance of the tactical air missions, sir. Yes.
Well,
And I think you've covered a very interesting
not
story.
entirely. No, I've got some.
Would you care to add something
Now,
on this point?
now as to the importance of tactical air power in World War II. Prior to World War II, practically all military aircraft operations were of a tactical nature. Further, they were considered to be and were primarily of an ancillary or supporting nature for the ground forces. During World War II, evolution of tactical aircraft tactics and techniques was so dramatic as to make them an indispensable and co-equal partner with the surface forces in joint operations. The attainment and maintenance of air superiority was essential to the freedom of movement and success of surface forces in their operations. Interdiction of enemy surface combat forces inflicted heavy casualties and prevented the movement of such forces into the battle area. Interdiction of supplies and ammunition denied the enemy surface forces of the means of sustaining their fighting power. Close air support of ground forces assisted them in attaining their objectives speedily and with the fewest possible casualties. This type of operation was highly popular with the ground forces as they could see the friendly aircraft and personally observe the results. In all these operations, tactical air could and did create conditions for friendly ground forces to go into battle with an unfair advantage over the enemy. As far as the overall commander of joint forces was concerned, tactical air power provided the quickest and most positive way of influencing his overall strategy. World War II proved tactical air to be a flexible and decisive instrument of war.
On a personal basis, sir, what do you consider your most interesting experience during World War II?
Well, there was never a dull moment for me in Europe during World War II. The invasion of the continent, Operation Overlord, was the most interesting experience, not experiment. It was a complex, massive, meticulously planned operation. Tactical fighters covered and successfully protected the invasion fleet from German air attack. We softened beach defenses. We prevented the movement of German reserve forces to the invasion area. We provided direct, close support to the ground forces as they got a foothold on French soil. That was a very interesting experience. Now, a rather unique experience took place in September of 1945. Third Army was spread out some 400 to 500 miles, with one corps attacking Brest out in the west of France. Two other corps were advancing rapidly to the east, somewhere around Paris or in that vicinity. The southern flank of the Third Army was wide open. To the south was a considerable German force, ground force that is. 19th attack kept them under surveillance. They attempted to drive north against Patton's south flank. Repeatedly, 19th Attack fighter bombers frustrated their efforts. When the U.S. 7th Army started driving north from their invasion in the south, General Elster, the German commander, foresaw the danger of being cut off in France and attempted to move back to Germany. 19th Attack fighter bombers methodically cut all rail lines and highway bridges. Apparently, night movement on foot and with horse-drawn vehicles became too costly because of the French Maquis and the FFI. They therefore attempted a desperate daylight withdrawal by road, on foot, by truck, by horse-drawn vehicle. Our tactical reconnaissance picked up these movements. I dispatched fighter bomber groups to the scene, and they mercilessly strafed and bombed the German columns. General Elster sent a message on 11 September saying that he would surrender his force if we would lay off our air attacks and assure him safe passage of his troops. On 16 September, Major General Bob Macon of the 83rd Infantry Division and I accepted the surrender of General Elster and his staff on the Bugency Bridge over the Loire River. The 83rd Division, which had never been in contact with the Germans at all, proceeded some 20,000 German POWs of Elster's force. This was a new and interesting chapter in the annals of air power. There were similar minor incidents where small pockets of German forces, when they were bombed and strafed by fighter bombers, would take off their undershirts, white undershirts, and wave them. We'd radio to the nearest ground forces, and they'd come and take them in. But that was the biggest bag that we had, those 20,000 ground troops.
While you were commanding general of the 19th Tactical Air Command, you furnished, as you have pointed out, invaluable air support to the Third Army under General Patton. How do you assess General Patton as a ground commander and colleague in this air-ground effort?
Well, I could wax pretty eloquent on that, of course. General Patton, George S. Patton, was the finest field army commander I have ever known. And I have operated intimately with several. He was admittedly colorful, but for a purpose. He was a driver. Being an old cavalryman, his standard order was to attack. Even when we outran his logistics, he would not admit to being on the defensive. Though his language was purposely a bit colorful, he was a deeply religious man. He was emotional. His forces suffered heavy casualties. He would cry like a baby. But he would then order them on in order to get the job done and accept more casualties if he considered it necessary. He was the finest teammate a tactical air commander could have. In England, he visited all of my air groups. I also visited all of his ground forces. But we were fighting. We were actually in war. He visited my air groups, which were on daily combat operations, and he achieved a new respect for air operations and the military precision involved. Now, there in England, we achieved a rather basic understanding. It was a personal understanding. Expressed very simply, it was that he would run the ground forces and I would run the air forces, and that we would lay all of our cards on the table. But there was no question about who would run the air. He respected that agreement throughout, and in fact became very enthusiastic about it later. We went operational as an air-ground team on 1 August 1945 on the continent. 19th Attack pretty much cleared the way for his advance, and he was amazed when his field troops, advanced units, told him that their worst impediment was the German transport and artillery, which littered the roads, and that fighter bombers had destroyed them. They had to be tank dozed off the roads and into the ditches. Patton became jubilant. Respect ripened up into utter confidence. He didn't think there was anything that the 19th Attack couldn't do. Largely because of his pervading leadership, relations between the 3rd Army and the 19th Attack were characterized by complete confidence in the other's abilities and a pervading spirit of loyalty and comradeship which extended clear down to the lowest units. In his periodic general orders, usually at the end of a major campaign, General Patton would issue an order and he would head his message as follows, quote, "To the officers and men of the 3rd U.S. Army and to our comrades of the 19th TAC." In that message, he was used to praising his troops, patting them on the back, and he would give co-equal praise to 19th TAC, always making it clear that they were not a part of the 3rd Army, that was my command, but that we were operating as a team. We wound up the war with mutual respect and very close friends.
Do you consider the decision to defeat Germany first a correct one?
Well, without going into any detail, I do indeed think that the decision to put priority on the defeat of Germany first was strategically correct. It was a major strategic decision, of course.
What do you consider, General Weyland, to be the major military lessons of World War II?
There were many, of course, but I think we can reduce it to two major lessons. There were, of course, many minor subsidiary lessons learned in the areas of tactics, techniques, organization, communications, command and control, support, and so on, but I won't go into those. The first major lesson in my mind was that air power had emerged as a decisive and dominant element in modern war. Modern forces without this element simply cannot prevail against joint forces, including adequate air power. Secondly, second major lesson, tactical air power must be retained under centralized control in a theater of operations. And on this point, I would like to mention two related occurrences. At the end of World War II, 11 May specifically, General Eisenhower called a meeting of his senior U.S. air and ground commanders at the headquarters of the 12th Army Group, Fritzlar, Germany. Present at that meeting, General Eisenhower, General Spaatz, USAF, General Bradley, 12th Army Group, General Vandenberg, 9th Air Force, Patton and Weyland, 3rd Army and 19th TAC, General Simpson, 9th Army, General Nugent, 29th TAC, General Hodges, the 1st Army, and General Sturley, 9th TAC. Pete Quesada had just gone home. General Eisenhower stated that the purpose of the meeting was to discuss and try to agree on the organization, doctrine, and employment of air and ground forces in joint operations. He went on to say that the concepts of command and employment as developed in Europe was most sound from his viewpoint and suitable for an overall commander such as he had been. The key was to retain air power under centralized control so that it could be used quickly, selectively, and effectively to influence the overall theater strategy as well as tactical influence through interdiction and close air support. To coordinate the latter functions directly affecting ground forces at the field Army Tactical Air Force level. At this meeting, there was some discussion by all present. Everybody, air and ground commanders, eventually concurred, and there was unanimous concurrence with General Eisenhower's views. This principle of centralized control and the concept of organization and tactical operations became the official Air Force concept and still is. The second related occurrence that I'd like to mention involved a former opponent, Field Marshal von Rundstedt, who had been the German Commander-in-Chief West of all German forces. Shortly after the conclusion of hostilities in Europe, I had a long talk with General von Rundstedt and asked for his comments and views on the organization, control, and employment of tactical air forces working with surface forces. As a preliminary to answering my question, this very erect and proper Prussian soldier reviewed his personal history and experiences to include the fact that he had worked up from the lower grades to be a division commander, then a corps commander, an army group commander, and eventually the commander-in-chief west of all German forces. With a twinkle in his eye, this very fine gentleman told me that the answer to his question would be rather lengthy. He said that if he were still a division commander and knowing the efficacy of tactical air power as he had experienced it on the receiving end, he would, of course, want a squadron or a group of tactical air assigned directly to his division for his exclusive employment in influencing the battle. He said that when he was a division commander at the head of some 16,000 to 18,000 men, he felt quite sure that the weight of the battle was on his shoulders and that the division structure was the basis of all military organization, and that he, of course, must have all of the tools available to help him in his task. General von Rundstedt went on to say that when he became a corps commander, that his comprehension and his vision had broadened, greatly broadened. He no longer was fettered with the administrative details of looking out for individual units and men, and felt that his corps of several divisions was truly a formidable force capable of strategic action. He said that as a corps commander, of course, he would want to have tactical air assigned, but that naturally, with his broadened vision, he would retain its control at the corps level in order to more effectively utilize its strategic capability in the corps mission. He would lend some of this effort to any division which might need it under specialized circumstances. Now, from the trend of these remarks, you can visualize what his views would have been as an Army or an Army group commander. He finally wound up by stating unequivocally, that theater air forces should be retained under centralized control with sufficient flexibility and coordination between air and surface forces so that air power could be used either in close support of ground forces or massed against distant targets as necessary in order to best accomplish the mission and objectives of the overall commander. Now, in commercial circles, they say that the customer is always right.
After World War II, sir, you became, in 1946 and 47, the Air Staff Director of Plans and Operations. During this period, the U.S. Air Force was established. What are your views concerning the organization of the Air Force when it was established in 1947? And also, of course, the Department of Defense.
Well, let's see. Our biggest problem, of course, at that time came about through the Unification Act of 1947, creating the United States Air Force as an autonomous force co-equal with the Army and the Navy. This act and the organization which ensued did fulfill its basic purpose. Our strength at the time was small, with essentially occupational tactical air forces in Germany and Japan, and all combat forces in the continental United States in a single command. SAC, TAC, and ADC were yet to come into existence, and considering the limited forces at the time, probably would have been inappropriate at the time. I do believe we were derelict at the time in not pressing strongly, or more strongly, for detailed agreement on the roles, missions, and responsibilities of this new U.S. Air Force, especially in the area of air defense and tactical air. I believe that General Eisenhower, who was then Chief of Staff of the Army, and the Army staff would have gone along with the doctrine, employment, command and control, and so on, as we had developed it in Europe, in World War II in Europe and in the Far East. Now, had we gotten these details pinned down, and I think they would have been accepted, we would have obviated much of the inter-service rivalry and bickering which subsequently developed and which is intensified later. I'm not sure. Yeah, I think that covered that.
Before the Korean War, July 1950, you were a key official at the Command and General Staff School and then at the National War College. What are your views on the adequacy of military education at the highest level?
Well, during World War II, the Command and General Staff School was established as a trade school, and they turned out staff officers. They did a very fine job with very short courses. There was very little depth to the instruction there, but we did turn out craftsmen who knew the methodology of staff work so that everybody talked the same language. It was successful, but would not be the type of educational system that we should have in peacetime. Accordingly, shortly after World War II, the Air Force established its Air University. At that time, it was obvious that we would become a separate Air Force, incidentally. And we revamped completely the entire Department of Defense educational system. Each service, each individual service, the Air Force and the Army and the Navy, established its system, which was then capped off by a DOD educational system, which was comprised of the Armed Forces Staff College, the Industrial College of the Armed Forces, and the National War College. The Air Force developed a very fine system which adequately, I think, takes care of education from the squadron level on up to senior officers who may or may not be able to go on to further advanced joint education. Our first really joint education, of course, takes place at Norfolk at the Armed Forces Staff College, and I think that has developed in a very splendid organization. Here we get experienced officers of all services with a sprinkling of civil servants together, and their experiences are pooled, and a great deal of progress is made. Again, one of the advantages being that officers of different services rub elbows and get to understand, know each other on a personal basis, and become better acquainted and understand the capabilities as well as the limitations of the other services, what their problems are, and so on. One of our finest things, I'm sure, is the Industrial College and the National War College. I was associated with the National War College for 3 classes as the Deputy Commandant for Instruction. At that school, as you know, we have officers on pretty much an equal basis, equal numbers from the 3 services, Army, Navy, and Air Force. And we also have a very liberal number of State Department or Foreign Service officers, plus some key personnel from other governmental agencies, occasionally one from Treasury, one from the Bureau of the Budget, which is a very good idea. And they, again, also get together. Now, the studies there go in great depth into all of the political, economic, as well as the military implications of war in the future, considering the weaponry that now exists and what may exist in the far foreseeable future. The military officer comes to acquire a new and deep respect and understanding of the political and economic implications of fighting a war. Conversely, the State and Foreign Service officers who have a great part in implementing our foreign policy, which eventually is translated perhaps into military action, learn the capabilities, limitations, and so on of the military arms. So that is the greatest thing, I think, that this country has ever done in an educational way.